Good evening. You are a beautiful, beautiful sight. A lot different than my day job, which is standing in front of 19-year-old college students, trying to get them interested in the Marshall Plan and the Civilian Conservation Corps and things like that. I tease, you guys are, I didn't have to convince you to come in, and there's this glowing orb in the sky. What is that out there today? I've been talking about this book since it came out in November, and I've been through a cyclone bomb and a polar vortex to go out to the state to talk about this book. So now we got beautiful weather, and thank you for coming in. I do have to say, you know, I always make a pitch for this. Our students, our college students, don't know much history for the most part. I think it's probably always been the case that young people, it's difficult to get them so interested in history, but I think it's getting a little worse with each year. And I don't know why that is the way it's taught in schools. I had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. I still know part of it. I don't know if parents aren't passed. I think a love of history, don't you think, has to be taught, has to be modeled. So if I've got a class of 35 students, I'll have 5 or 6 students. They're very bright. They're all very bright. Out of 35 students, I'll have 5 or 6 who know a lot of history. And it's because their parents took them to Civil War battlefields. They maybe had a really good teacher in junior high or middle school. Or they watched the History Channel with Dad back when the History Channel used to have history. Remember those days? Long time ago. But so I'm preaching to the choir in here. You are my people. You are beautiful. Will you please all come with me tomorrow for my class at Detroit Mercy, and we'll get them interested. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin of this new book, Michigan POW Camps. Some stories I discovered in doing it, and show you some images. I've got a slideshow that I'll take you through. And then my favorite part of these events as I go around and talk about the book is to hear from you. Because I always hear new stories from people. My dad was a guard, or my grandfather, saw the Italians down at Fort Wayne. Let me first ask you, how many of you knew, raise your hand, that there were POW camps, around 6,000 Germans and Italians? Get them up way high so I can say, oh, this is not a normal crowd. About half the room already knew this. And maybe some of you have some stories or something you discovered or artifact that you found. I'd like to hear your stories if you have them, so I'll leave plenty of time for interaction and Q&A. The first thing, though, I have to do a disclaimer, which I think I did last time. I keep writing books about Michigan and Detroit in World War II, and the confession is I ain't from here. I am not from Michigan. I am a Hoosier from Indianapolis, Indiana. But I've been here since 1993, and I know the streets. I drive all around Detroit and Metro Detroit, and now with this new book, I've been all over the state of Michigan. I know all kinds of things. I dare you, give me a map test. I'm really good. And I know things like, did you know that Fremont, Michigan is the baby food capital of the world? Raise your hand if you knew that. Oh, look, you're not a normal crowd. I'm going to start crying. This is beautiful. The Gerber Company, which, by the way, is German-American, there were German prisoners of war working for them in the processing plant and also harvesting string beans and squash. And so when I went to Fremont, that's why it smelled like steamed squash and prunes. I know a lot of things, baby food capital of the world. I even made a trip to this place called the UP, which Carl was referencing. And I will tell you a story about Germ-Fask. I promise you. How many have heard of Germ-Fask, Michigan? You guys, you're planted. Many people know. I do have an interesting story about that. But I'm still a Hoosier. I do think that me not growing up here, and too bad I didn't get to go into the Hudson's building. I didn't need to. I didn't have Sanders hot fudge sundae till I was 40. I didn't have Better Made potato chips. Faygo I had. And I sometimes I lapse into my Hoosierisms, and I'll say, well, do we have any East Siders in the room? Probably not. How'd you get over here? Did you? It's a long I have been told the propaganda is there's a big difference between the east and west side. How many of you are west siders? Oh my gosh, I'll walk out to your car with you. Actually, I've discovered there really is not much difference. But I'll say, I met somebody on the east side recently, and I said, yeah, I'll meet you over there on Gratiot Avenue. Or my university, U of D, is on Livernois, all these French. And occasionally I introduce movies. Maybe you've been there at the historic Redford Theater, which is a West Side institution. And how many of you have been to the Redford Theater? Look at this. You're my people. Next time you're there, if I'm emceeing, check with me before the show and we'll work out the 50-50 raffle. It's kind of tricky to cheat in front of 500 people, but we'll do it. But I think the Redford's on some street called Lasher. So I'm still a Hoosier and a bit of an outsider, but I think I see things about Michigan and about Detroit that really make it a unique place on the planet, and maybe some of you who were born and raised here maybe kind of take for granted. And can I give one more confession that my Hoosier brain I've never said this in public, this is embarrassing. My Hoosier brain can't get around this idea that you all drive south to go to Canada. This does not, I don't understand that still. They tell me to go through a tunnel and all of that. But at any rate, I love Michigan, and I consider myself a Detroiter now, honorary. And I've enjoyed it, and I'm absolutely fascinated. We were just talking about World War II. They'll be writing new books about the Second World War for 1,000 years at least. It's an inexhaustible topic. And so I've been privileged and really enjoyed being able to write about. I got to watch how far I can take this thing here. How did my research begin? About 6 years ago, I got a call from the History Press, which is based in South Carolina. They do local and regional history books. They're with the Arcadia books too. Is there a Barnes & Noble somewhere around here? You'll find maybe copies. I got a call from the History Press, and the guy said to me, well, we have a book on Baltimore in World War II, and we have a book on Pittsburgh in World War II. Would you like to write a book about Detroit? And before he finished the sentence, I said, I'll take it. You know, what a great topic. The arsenal of democracy. You got to be kidding me. And they dangerously gave me free rein to gather pictures, to do research. And I wrote a book for them, Detroit in World War II, and got to talk in libraries and historical societies and museums. And I learned so much, every aspect of life in Detroit, not just Willow Run and the Detroit the Warren tank arsenal. They built a tank arsenal way out there at 12 Mile and Mound, way out in the country. I talk about, did you know there were 100 movie theaters in the city of Detroit during World War II? There was rationing, conservation, Victory Gardens, Rosie the Riveter, 500 miles of streetcar in the city of Detroit. How many of you are Detroiters? You grew up in Detroit. Look at this. That's really great. So you ought to be talking to me more than me talking to you about it. I talk about sports. There was a guy named Hank Greenberg, who's the big hero of the book. Hit a grand slam in the ninth inning of the last game of the 1945 season. Having come back from 4 years in the Army Air Corps, hit a grand slam to put the Tigers into the 1945 World Series. That's a veteran coming back and really performing and inspiring people. And then he hit two more and he beat my Chicago Cubs in 1945. But that's another whole story. Many great stories in here. And most people, I really wrote this book for my students also. I thought they should know what their great-grandparents were doing. They had to know. Maybe their great-uncle had been flying B-24s and he's 21 years old getting shot at. They don't know. A lot of them really hardly know what Pearl Harbor is, I have to say. And we need to, that's very bad, as you know. And, the other thing, by the way, my young people that I teach are very smart, but I blame this too. They're addicted to these machines. These phones, you know what I'm talking about. And I don't think it encourages them to reflect on, who was Hank Greenberg and why should I care? There's a lot of good reasons. So I wrote this book to kind of interest young people and I enjoyed doing it. And so the history press liked it, and they said, do you have any other ideas? And Carl mentioned this. And I said, yeah, I do. I discovered in the course of looking at Detroit, the arsenal of democracy during the Second World War, there were these Italian prisoners of war down at Fort Wayne by the river. Who knew that, you know? And, I devote a couple of paragraphs to them in this book. I said, I just looked into it. They were part of a statewide program, mostly Germans, but also Italians, about 6,000, who were brought to the state of Michigan between 1943 and 1946, which was then part of a larger program, a national program of over 425,000 Germans and Italians that were shipped across the Atlantic from the war zones, brought to the United States, and scattered around the country. And it's interesting. It's a good story, by the way. We followed the Geneva Convention. I'm not sure if other countries were doing that in World War II, but we tried to. We treated these guys mostly humanely. There was a real effort to weed out the bad guys. I mean, there were Nazis and fascists and bullies and creeps. They tried to weed those guys out. If you're captured and they see the SS tattoo under, is it your right or left armpit, you're not coming to America. Or if you do come to America, you're going to high security, way out in Colorado or some remote location. The 6,000 Germans and Italians who were brought here were kept under pretty minimum security, and we treated them mostly pretty well, and they worked, and they got to know Americans. They even worked for individual family farmers. And despite the fact that there were strict rules against fraternization, do not fraternize with these German and Italian enemy combatants, good luck enforcing that. There's a lot of interaction and fraternization that goes on. People get to know these guys. They mostly behaved. They mostly worked hard. They struck up friendships and even almost family relations with some of the families that they worked for. And I thought that was a beautiful story. And when they all had to be sent back at the end of the war. They all had to be repatriated. Some of them didn't want to go. Would you want to go back to devastated Germany or Italy in 1946, 45? Maybe to see your family, for sure. Some of them didn't want to go back. Many of them found a way they kept in touch with the families and the Americans and the guards that they knew. It wasn't perfect. There were conflicts. There were bad guys, but for the most part, it's a very positive story. They went back with a very positive impression of America. And later on, as they had families, they would bring their families back to Midland, Michigan, and Niles, Michigan, and Sodus, Michigan, and Fort Wayne. And here's where I was, and let's go see where my guard's family is. I don't think a lot of American prisoners of war in German hands were doing that. Let's go back and see the camp where I was held. Our guys were held under very brutal conditions for the most part. So we treated them mostly well. We tried to follow the Geneva Convention. And many of them, here's the really beautiful thing, many of them later came back and became American citizens. And so I think it's a good story, even in the middle of a catastrophic world war, global. You got Germans, 1,000 of them up in the UP, cutting trees, working in pulp mills. They got to know Americans, they got to know people, they got to know Finns and Italians and Germans up in the UP and people of Irish descent and Native Americans. In the middle of all this, enemies kind of got to know each other a little bit. My theory is that when human beings get to know each other a little bit, they start to treat each other like human beings. And that's kind of the story I wanted to tell. So it turned out to be a good story. And I researched it. I traveled over all the state. There were, like I say, 425,000 prisoners across the country in over 500 camps in mostly remote places. And in Michigan, there were around 6,000 prisoners. And I passed out a map, I hope you have, giving you a rough idea of the 32 camps in Michigan where Germans and Italians and a few others were held. By the end of the war, the Germans were putting anybody in field gray that they could grab. There's a Pole over here, and here's a Romanian. There was a Russian up at the UP. I don't know how he got up there. But, they were brought over 32 camps around the state. Do not use this map, by the way, as a road map. It's not drawn to scale. But you can see the 32 camps. Many of them, there's nothing left of them. Many of them were very short term. They were tent camps. They put them in Civilian Conservation Corps barracks. They put them in Army barracks at Owasso. You know where Owasso, Michigan is? I do this now, somewhere. I've been to the Thumb. I've been to all parts of Michigan. Did I go to all 32 campsites? No. I went to 28 of them. A couple of them I didn't quite make it to, but I did make my one trip to the UP. They were scattered around the state, and they mostly helped in the area of agriculture, where we had a big labor shortage. So it's a good story. Well, how did the program actually begin? I think I've got people in this room. You could probably tell me more about World War II and its battles and the changing fortunes than I've studied. But we both watch the American Heroes channel, so I know the big picture. World War II, and I tell my students, we could have lost World War II. We got in very late, and the bad guys were winning. 1940, 41, Pearl Harbor. 42 was a bad year. I would say, maybe you agree with me, I'm using you as my expert down here. By 43, I think 1943 is really the pivot year for our war against the Axis, the Italians and the Germans. We begin to turn the tables, we begin to start to win. And our first victories, interestingly, were in North Africa. Did you know that? Operation Torch, November of 42. 6 months of tough fighting, good gosh, in the deserts against Rommel and the Afrika Korps. Good Lord, it was tough fighting. We had green troops, green American troops. The Kasserine Pass, it was bloody. But we and the British ended up winning. And by May of 1943, we have defeated the Axis in North Africa. And now we're ready to go to Sicily, to the Italian mainland. And of course, the big show in this part of the world is going to be Normandy, which is up, France. That's going to be in 1944. Did you know, by the way, that in 2 weeks is the 75th anniversary of the D-Day Invasion? Who in this room, anybody remember that invasion, maybe hearing about it on the radio? Or I see a hand back there. No, you're too young. I don't believe. Do you remember? You actually remember that? You were born 2 days later.
I hear it on the radio and I'm thinking, wow, that's a long time.
Way back in olden days, yeah. My college freshmen, they were born in 2001. They don't remember 9/11. They don't remember recent things, many of them. So we start to win the war, and I've got to say, victory is good. We defeated the Germans, we defeated the Afrika Korps, we defeated the Italians. By the way, I have to say the Italians were very happy to be out of the war for the most part. They were surrendering in Tunisia and in Libya like this, Please take us, Americans, get us out of this war that we didn't want, away from Mussolini and Hitler, and get the Italians. And by the time they got to Fort Wayne, they were treated well. They were pretty happy to be out of the war. Many of the Germans were very happy as well. Victory is good, May 1943, but it presents a problem. Suddenly, we have tens of thousands of prisoners, captured enemy soldiers on our hands. What are we going to do with them? We're keeping them in open-air stockades. There's sand fleas, inadequate sanitation, very temporary facilities. It's overloaded. What are we going to do with all these bodies, these captured prisoners? And we had, by the way, told them, we will follow the Geneva Convention, and you'll get humane treatment. I think the authorities, Eisenhower and others, they were expecting maybe 70,000 POWs. We had 225,000 prisoners, and they had to go somewhere. And England said, we're full, and we're bankrupt, and we can't take them. What are we going to do? I give credit for the American POW program to a man who should still be a household name. At one time he was General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, a brilliant man. Can you imagine his job? President Roosevelt basically said, here, General Marshall, here's the Pacific, here's the European theater, win the war, And he did it. He was a very smart person. Marshall came up with an idea that he said, look, I got an idea here. We have these Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic every week, quickly built tin cans, really, taking soldiers over to the war fronts across the Atlantic, taking materiel. They're coming back to the States almost empty. Why don't we load these guys onto these ships, take them across the Atlantic, take them to the United States, where we got the facilities and the food to take care of them. Probably not much of an escape risk. If you're up in Germfast, Michigan, German prisoner, where are you going to go, really? You know? But the other thing is, and here's the brilliant part, Marshall, killing two birds with one stone. We have an incredible labor shortage in the United States, especially in agriculture. In Michigan, orchards, fruit was rotting in the trees. Sugar beets were in high demand, and there weren't enough hands for the harvest. A great demand for paper, the UP's trees and pulpwood industry. Marshall noted that under the Geneva Convention, these prisoners can work. They can volunteer to work. They will be getting sort of a minimal compensation, safe conditions and all of that, but they can help fill the labor gap. To me, that's Yankee ingenuity. That's killing two birds with one stone. Thank you, General Marshall. That's what they did. They started to load these guys onto these Liberty, took them to Casablanca and some of the deep sea ports, maybe a stop off in Liverpool, and then across the Atlantic toward this place called America, which most of these guys had no idea really what it was. And by the way, the Germans and the Italians, even at this point, they weren't quite sure they could believe the Americans. We've been told we'll be lined up and shot after being tortured. Can we really believe their promises of humane treatment? They didn't quite know where they were going. They were pretty disoriented. They were loaded onto these ships like sardines, and I've seen pictures below the deck. There were 6, 7, 8 bunks stacked on top of each other. They got maybe an hour a day on the deck to get some fresh air and, quote, some exercise. There wasn't any room to move around, really. And they made the journey across the Atlantic toward the ports of the eastern seaboard of the U.S. And keep in mind, most of these guys, the first wave were from North Africa. They were Panzer Grenadier, they were tankers, they were pilots, they were infantry guys. They weren't used to the North Atlantic and the Atlantic Ocean. It's a very rough ride on a ship that was never built for comfort. And it's about a week of stomach-churning journey with bad food, and they're kind of still scared about where they're going. And then add to this, by 1943, there were still German U-boats out there all over the Atlantic, and I don't think German U-boat captains were saying, you know, that American ship over there, it might have some Germans on it. Let's not shoot at that one. They were not thinking that way. So it was a perilous journey, and most of them remembered it as the most stomach-churning experience of their lives. And they begin to arrive in the late summer of 1943. Midsummer, actually, and they arrive in Boston and New York Harbor and Newport News in Virginia, the big ports. Who's been to New York Harbor by boat? It's a pretty impressive sight, is it not? It's awesome. These guys, they arrived, let's say New York, they looked around and their first thought was, oh my gosh, New York is still standing. It has not been reduced to rubble and smoke and fire like we had been told. The Germans had been told that the Fuhrer had destroyed the eastern seaboard cities in America, and they were in awe as they looked around and they arrived. And I really believe, particularly for the German prisoners, I think this may be the first moment they began to look around and say, you know what, we might not be winning this war against the United States. Look at all this activity, look at these buildings, good Lord. They come off the gangplanks. And by the way, there are some things I'm amused by. One is the War Department tried to keep this program secret. Thousands of people came out to gawk at these guys as they came off the ships. Hey, Franz. Hey, Luigi. Maybe some call you dirty Nazi. You know, there were people giving them a hostile reception, but thousands turned out to see him. You cannot keep something this big secret. I mean, you just can't do it. They then, and every soldier in the room knows about being treated like cattle. You know, they were deloused from the desert experience and deloused again, tagged, vaccinated, interviewed. And every soldier, German and Italian, was issued work fatigues, blue or green, with PW stenciled all over, front, back, sides, large letters. Imagine trying to escape wearing these work fatigues. They had to wear these anytime they were not on the base or the camp where they would eventually be assigned. They could keep what was left of their combat uniforms, their tattered Afrika Korps clothing, or the Italians. They could wear those in the camp where they'd eventually be stationed. But they were given these work fatigues. It pretty much clearly identified them as PWs, prisoners of war. They're loaded onto trains, Pullman cars that have been stripped of all their luxuries, bars on the windows, and I quote Conrad Crichton, who ended up at Camp Blissfield, a German soldier. How many of you know where Blissfield, Michigan is? I've been there. I know right where it is. Conrad Crichton remembered, the first thing we got on this train, and we're a little disoriented, first thing that happened to us is these black porters got on the train and started serving us coffee and donuts. And we're like, that's interesting. Maybe we will be treated okay. Maybe we're not headed for our deaths. They begin to make the move from Boston, from New York, from Virginia, toward points inland. And initially, most of the prisoners were taken to the south and the southwest. In 1943, in Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, New Mexico, the War Department figured you don't have to heat buildings in these places in the wintertime. It'll be cheaper. But these guys were actually a precious resource. And the Great Lakes states, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, they began to lobby. We need labor too. We want some prisoners too. So they began to arrive in the Great Lakes also at that time. And I'm sure, by the way, every German child, every German boy in particular, read books by a writer named Karl May as a youth. He wrote books about the Wild West. And I'm sure as these guys are pulling into New Jersey, looking out the windows, they're probably going, where are the buffalo? Where are the Indians? Where are the cowboys and horses, They don't quite know where they're going. And it's a long trip. These guys, Italians and Germans, they never quite figured out the scale of our country. How long does it take to go by train from New York, wartime, to New Mexico? I mean, a long time. And you're not priority traffic. Some of them, one guy said, this has to be a Yankee trick. They're just taking us around in circles. This country cannot be this big. And again, I think they saw individual Americans driving their own vehicles. They saw this wealth. They saw this space. And I'm sure a lot of them are starting to think, oh, well, who are we fighting here? Good Lord. Big country. My students hate that I have this mind for dates. I'm sorry, I just do. September 27th, 1943. That is when the first shipment of 270 Germans arrive by train from Camp Sheridan, which is around Chicago. And they arrived to help with the fruit harvest. They arrived in a town called Benton Harbor, Michigan. And they arrived, midnight, late September, to help with the fruit harvest. And guess what? The whole town turned out to look at them, wave at them, throw candy bars at them, just look at them out of curiosity. They were shipped over to the Naval Armory. That's where they were held. And they were taken by truck every day. And they worked in the fields for 3-4 weeks. Did a great job. Worked hard, didn't cause trouble, were good, citizens. And it was a bit of an experiment. Then the War Department said, okay, Michigan, we'll try another one. They sent those guys over to a place called Cairo, Michigan, which is in a place called the Thumb. And same group, they worked for 2-3 weeks digging, picking sugar beets. At Ortonville 2 nights ago, and a guy says, you don't pick sugar beets, you dig them. It's hard work, it's back-breaking work, and then you got to top them. And they worked in Cairo. The whole town came out to see them. They were held at the fairgrounds on the edge of town, and it worked out. And now, by late 43, the War Department says, okay, Michigan, you can have large numbers of Germans and Italians to come in to help with your agricultural deficit, work deficit in particular. By the way, did you know, my students are amazed that during World War II there was rationing of all kinds of things. What was rationed during World War II? Sugar. Gasoline, 3 gallons per week if you have an A coupon. Try that. Butter, well, they had something called oleo that you add this yellow dye to. Rubber, forget about getting tires. They didn't build new cars. Lots of things were rationed. My students are always... Did I hear somebody say nylons? Yeah. What'd they use nylons for? Parachutes, that's right. I want to say to you that Michigan sugar beets were in extremely high demand during World War II because you couldn't get cane sugar. So they needed lots of help, and these Germans did a good job doing it. And which brings me to my poem. Can I do a very brief poem for you that has to do with rationing during World War II? There was a columnist in 500 newspapers around the country named Walter Winchell. And he wrote a little poem about rationing. And see, I don't do poems. Let me see if I can remember it. It goes like this. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet. Remember? So, sugar beets. And they began to arrive. They did a lot of picking fruit on the west coast of Michigan and over in the southwest. And again, sugar beets in the Michigan Sugar Bowl in the central part of the state. And then the pulpwood mills. But they did all kinds of agricultural jobs, dairy. And not only did they work for big companies, like over in southwest Michigan, they worked for Heinz and Welch's. They worked for Michigan Sugar over at Croswell. But they also could work for individual farmers. If you were a farmer or owned an orchard, you could go to your county extension agency. They'd print a notice in the paper, and if you could show the need, you had to take a minimum of 10 prisoners from the local camp, whatever was closest. You had to pick them up. You had to drop them off at night. You had to make sure they had safe conditions. But they worked for individual families, and that's where really you begin to see some fraternization going on. They arrive in large numbers. Every camp, and they put them in fairgrounds. At Owasso, there is an auto racetrack 5 miles west of town on M25. I've been there. They had a tent camp for the guys working there picking sugar beets, digging sugar beets, sorry. See, I'm from Indiana. We don't have sugar beets. Maybe we do, I don't know. Every camp, even the brief tent camps that were just there for the harvest, they had the prisoners. An advance team would build a double ring of barbed wire, build a guard tower. There had to be latrines and sanitation. Every camp had to have an infirmary. It had to have a recreation space. These are young guys with lots of energy, and they can't just sit around when they're not working. And they let their own officers do most of the discipline in the camps. And this mostly Germans outstate and in Detroit. The Fort Wayne POWs actually did a lot of city jobs. They worked in parks and they did road construction, kind of CCC type work, the Civilian Conservation Corps. But mostly it was agricultural work. Who was guarding these people? Who worked at the camps in Michigan? Well, there were some very excellent guards who were, spit and polish, but most of them probably not so much. To be working security at a camp in Sidnaw, Michigan in 1944 in the UP is not a high priority, high status job. So a lot of the guards tended to be maybe older guys, maybe they have a little bit of a pot belly, maybe they're not so, skilled in marching and their rifle and so forth, and some of them take naps. The bottom line, as Emily Foster told me, I talked to this woman who had groups of 10 Germans come to her family's orchards over by Eau Claire, Michigan, 3 different summers. Her comment to me was about the guards, where are they going to go? Where are these guys going to escape to? They're not much of an escape risk. And so they got to know these guards, and they actually kind of watched out for each other, as I've discovered. By the way, as these Germans and Italians worked, they did get paid under the Geneva Convention. They got paid 80 cents a day up to for a 10-hour day. They could work 6 days a week. And they didn't just say at the end of a week, here, Hans, here's your $3 cash, because Hans might slip into Kalamazoo or might really try to escape. They paid the guys in scrip or in coupons. And the program in Michigan was really centered through Fort Custer. Who's been to Fort Custer? Have anybody been to Fort Custer National Cemetery, which I'm going to say some things about? It's a beautiful place. I wish everyone would go. The guards watched them. There were very few escape attempts. Most of them were small scale. Guys were caught very quickly. They didn't quite know where they were. They're wearing these work fatigues. There were a couple of guys caught. They walked off a job site. Well, I'll tell you, my favorite, Gerd Lindemann was an Africa Corps officer who was at Camp Allegan, Lakewood. You know where Allegan is, south of Holland? And it's a former CCC camp where they kept these Germans. Gerd Lindemann was the head of the Germans there. He kind of disciplined them. And he came back and became lived in West Michigan after the war. He said, I'll give you an idea. He said he remembered one time two of his guys walked off. They were picking peaches in September. And a couple of the guys walked off, two Germans jumped into Lake Allegan and just swam their heads off, and just they're young, fit guys, and they swim. And they get to the other side, and they're dripping, and they're exhausted, and the Michigan State Police is just there waiting for them. And, the officer said, what were you guys thinking? And he said, well, we thought we just swam Lake Michigan. We're trying to get to Chicago. We heard there might be some Germans who would help us out. A couple of guys walked off a job site over by Camp Sodus, and they were picked up. And one guy said, well, I got a cousin down in South America. I was going to try to walk down and can you walk to New York? Or, they never figured out the scale of the place.
They didn't have your map.
That map wouldn't have helped either, trust me. Where are they going to go? That's the question. And by the way, what did they do with these coupons? Every camp had to have a little PX or a canteen. Some more elaborate than others. Fort Custer's was very elaborate. And they could buy razor blades and Hershey's chocolate bars, Lucky Strikes, the good cigarettes, Chesterfields. They could buy writing paper. Get this, the Germans at Fort Custer could even buy beer with their money that they were making. And they had a little makeshift bar, one per customer per night, 10 cents, and I'm sure they were cheating on that. And I can assure you folks that in the back area under the barracks, in certain barracks at Fort Custer, they were making schnapps. And I know the Italians were making, have you ever had grappa? They were making that stuff. They had moonshine and all that stuff. And so they spent the money, and they could even buy alcohol, 3-2 beer. You asked to me, I'm shocked that there's drinking going on and gambling. Why wouldn't the guards crack down on this? They were doing it with them, look the other way. Lots of stories of lax security, which kind of amusing. I got a guy who was at Monroe, Michigan, had a camp nearby. And this guy remembers, he's in his 80s now. He said, I'm 10 years old, and we go out and watch the Germans working in the field, and they're kind of interesting to us. And he said, I'm 10 years old. The guard came up to me and said, here, kid, take my rifle. Watch these guys. I'll be back in 3 or 4 hours. And I'm going to visit my girlfriend, And he looked over, and the Germans were just laughing. It was not a problem. My favorite story about the relationship between guards and prisoners. Again, it's Camp Allegan and Gerd Lindemann. He was an Africa Corps officer. He said, we realized our guards weren't spit and polish. They kind of slouched. They didn't look to be in great physical shape. They had their hands in their pockets when they talked to their officers. They weren't really spit and polish guys. They were good guys. We watched out for them. They watched out for us. If we see the commandant coming out to check on things from the camp, we'd all get busy, and everybody took care of each other. Gerd Lindemann remembered this story of one day he said, my guys decided we're going to play a joke, a little prank on our guard who liked to take a nap every afternoon precisely at 2:15. He'd start dozing in the beautiful, warm Michigan September sun. Sounds good, doesn't it? It's not, well, you're getting there. Yeah, sounds like Schultz. We're all going in that direction. And Lindemann even said that. He said, so a couple of my guys snuck up and, we're in the trees, and we snuck up and slipped his rifle out from under him. We took it apart and we hid it in the bushes all around. And then another one of my guys took some pebbles and started throwing at the guard's helmet. He had his helmet. Ding, ding. About the third one, he wakes up. Oh, no. Oh, I'm in trouble. Oh, my gosh. Oh, where's my rifle? Where's my rifle? I hate to use the word extortion, ransom, blackmail. The guy said, we know where it is. And let me just put it to you this way. Those German guys had all the candy bars and Lucky Strikes they could smoke for the next month. Whatever it took, give me back I got to have my rifle. So that's not it. Lindemann said, so we got the pieces, we gave it back to him. He couldn't put it together. So we did it for him. Now this is, not everything worked so smoothly, but this is an example. And it actually, Lindemann said, it was like Hogan's Heroes in reverse, thinking of Sergeant Schultz. Most of the escapes were very brief. The guys didn't really know where they were going. There was one, though, the most scandalous escape in the entire national POW system happened in Michigan in Owasso. And what happened was two young ladies, Shirley Druce and Kitty Case, 20 and 19, worked at the local cannery in downtown Owasso, Michigan, side by side with these young Africa Corps guys, with other women and men. Romances developed, and I guess that's going to happen sometimes. And they decided, by the way, I talked to a lady just a couple weeks ago. She says, I was 14 on the east side of Detroit in 1945. Me and my girlfriends used to go down to the state fairgrounds and flirt with the Italian prisoners and throw candy bars at them. And, hey, Luigi, you're mine. Oh, we're going to get married after the war. Usually it didn't happen. And this happened. A lady explained to me these romances that sometimes developed. She raised her hand. I think, where was this? This was at Ortonville. A lady said, why did these romances? I never really understood. She said, there was a man shortage, too, during World War II. And so here are these cute, available guys. And by the way, not everybody was delighted about this good treatment. And I've traveled the state and read newspapers in Owasso and all these towns. And there's always an angry letter, several, saying, my brother just got killed at Guadalcanal. Or my cousin is over in a ditch by Saint Lo, and the word I keep seeing is they're being coddled. And this was kind of the rumor that they were getting lavish treatment. In fact, that's not the word that I keep reading. The word is mollycoddled. Isn't that a great word? These guys are being mollycoddled. I'm going to start using that with my students next fall. I'm not going to mollycoddle you young people. They were not. There was a congressman who visited several camps in Michigan, spoke to the newspapers trying to get some headlines. Yeah, the Camp Custer's like the Waldorf Astoria, the mess hall and all that. And so there were the rumors of being coddled and lavish treatment. In reality, the conditions, I would call them, can I use this word? Spartan. You know what I mean by that. Very basic. They did have plentiful food and put on weight they'd lost in the desert, or later from Italy, or later from France. But I wouldn't call it coddling. But I certainly understand, and these stories about romances going on, Italian parishes, Catholic parishes, adopting Italians to come have holiday dinners and have dances with the people. This didn't go over well with everybody, and I certainly understand why that would be a problem. And by the way, the Italians, Italy signed an armistice in 1943. They dropped out of the war. So technically, under international law, the Italians were not POWs. They became Italian Service Unit guys. They had a lot more freedom. They had weekend passes. And like I say, they could be invited to people's homes on a Sunday and have grandma's cannoli. How many people, by the way, I think it was very helpful for the Germans and the Italians that there are so many people in Michigan. Certainly in Detroit and the UP, there's a lot of Italians ready there. They can speak the language. They adopt them almost like, family members. How many in this room have some Italian descent? No one. One, two, okay. Buonasera, buonasera. Now, here's the other question, and this will get a different reaction. How many in this room have some German descent? Basically everybody, The fact that there are so many Germans, especially in rural Michigan, certainly made it easier for these guys to get along with the people they met and worked for. And I don't talk about the Japanese POWs. First of all, there weren't very many Japanese POWs. They didn't surrender. And secondly, very, very few were brought to the United States. There were a couple of high security camps out west, but basically there were none in Michigan, and it would have been very difficult. There's not much of a Japanese population. So Germans and Italians. Shirley and Kitty formed I guess they were flirting, and they came up with an idea to help spring their boyfriends. So Shirley borrowed her mother's Plymouth, drove up by prearrangement to the back of the cannery in downtown Owasso, and out of the bushes came two German Afrika Korps guys, climb in the back of the car with the two girls, and off they drive into the Michigan night. And apparently they went out to a lake and they danced and they shared pictures, and it was kind of innocent, really. But the authorities didn't take this as a joke. There was a manhunt all night long. They caught him. They picked him up at 7 a.m. the next morning. The two Germans had tried escapes before, and they were sent to high security out west, Wyoming, New Mexico. Now the question presents itself, what do you do with Kitty and Shirley? What are you going to do with these two girls? Well, they called in to come out to Owasso FBI agents from Detroit to interrogate them. You probably know about this. To interrogate them. Are you Nazi sympathizers? Are you part of a larger spy ring? What's going on here? They put them in jail. And for a couple of days, they actually thought of charging these two girls with treason, which in wartime carries a death penalty. Ultimately, it was decided they would charge them with a lesser charge of conspiracy. And they were tried. Can you imagine a trial in federal court in Bay City, Michigan in 1945? It got international press coverage. The newspapers ran with this, the American sweetheart and the Nazi escapees and all of this. And they were both convicted, and one served a year and the other served a year and 3 months in federal prison. And it's as soon as each of them got out, Shirley and Kitty, they moved as far away from Shiawassee County, Michigan, as they could get. One went to Georgia, one went to California, and they kind of hid this whole story from their families. It ruined their lives, to tell you the truth. And I'm here to tell you they're still talking about it in Owasso. I was there 2 months ago. Oh, I remember those two girls and the whole thing. So this notorious escape happened in Michigan. I want to get to some slides here in a minute, just run through those. I got to talk one thing, though, about safety. Under the Geneva Convention, these people are supposed to get safe conditions, but, agricultural work is dangerous. Cutting pulp wood in the UP, injuries happened. There were a few isolated fatalities. And they told the Germans, by the way, the Germans arrived at Camp Sidnaw, which is in the UP. They arrived in February. And some of them got off the train and said, I like this much better than the desert. This is like home, And they worked hard. They told the Germans, not only are the blades kind of dangerous, they said there are wolves and bears out there, so sing loud while you're working. That'll keep them away. Most of the incident, mostly safe conditions, but the worst accident in the entire national system also happened in Michigan at Camp Blissfield. It was actually Halloween of 1945, October 31, 1945. And by the way, you're saying to me, how come we're talking about fall of 45? We kept these guys until 46. Most of them did. They all wanted to go home on VE Day or not go home at all. It took a long time for them to go home. What happened was there were a group of Germans. They had planned a Halloween celebration. Some of the artists in the camp had made masks. The cooks had made a special sausage dish. They're going to have a Halloween celebration that night. They spent the day digging Michigan sugar beets, not pulling, digging them. They worked hard all day. They're getting ready. They're taken back on the flatbed truck. They're going to be taken back to Camp Blissfield. And the driver pulled across the train tracks, 4:45 in the afternoon, and he was later exonerated of any guilt because some brush had overgrown the view of this curve and the sign. A New York Central passenger train slammed into the truck and sent men flying 500 feet and more. 16 Germans were killed, most of them immediately. And the guard from Cadillac was also killed. And the bodies were being recovered well into the night. And you know what's interesting? This was a tragedy for the entire community. Because these guys had been around, they got to know these folks, and people came out to help with rescue. And it was ultimately decided that these Germans are going to be allowed to do full military ceremonies for their fallen comrades. So the War Department, they made special orders. They flew in German flags from the quartermaster in Philadelphia to drape the coffins. And they had they brought in Lutheran minister, Catholic priest at Camp Custer. They played taps, they sang German hymns. The entire town had a moment of silence for these fallen guys. 16 dead Germans, and by the way, they're still there. I said there's not a lot left of a lot of the camps, but I was in camp. Did you go to Section B of Camp Fort Custer National Cemetery? If you go there, you'll see a row of 26 headstones in a special section with German names. And 16 of them were killed in the Blissfield accident. And their families, after the war, decided to leave them there. But what's beautiful about this is, I like this idea of enemies burying the hatchet, sort of. In the 50s, German veterans groups partnered with the American Legion and some American veterans and the German consulate in Detroit. And they started having an annual ceremony for these. 26 are buried there. Others died of miscellaneous causes. So the third Sunday of every November, Volkstrauertag, there is a solemn ceremony for these young men, very young men who are so far from home. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing to think about. I'll go to, hopefully you can see, I'm going to be like the weatherman here. Does this work? Yeah. Okay, I'll just run through some of these are all images from the book, and then I'd like to hear if you have some stories. This is the Escanaba somewhere, right, in the UP. This is May of 1943, and you can see we've defeated the Axis in North Africa. You can see Churchill and Roosevelt there. Victory is sweet, but we have a real problem. Germans by the tens of thousands, as well as Italians. This is in Tunisia. They surrendered. They're being walked into stockades. Where are we going to put these guys? Well, we loaded them onto these Liberty ships, and you can see the cramped conditions. It was like sardine. This would be their 1 hour above the deck. Germans on a ship headed for the United States. Very stomach churning, and they arrive. This is from the National Archives. Some of the pictures I took, and some of them are from libraries and museums. These are German Afrika Korps guys having just arrived in Boston, having been processed, and they're being loaded on trains to be head to places west. And see the guard standing atop. The security was pretty high at the beginning, and then as time went on, the security became a little more lax. But you can see they're wearing their Afrika Korps clothing. This is a very rough picture showing you the distribution across the United States, and see the number in Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana. But you see, and do not use this as a road map either, please. But it gives you a rough idea. I think every state but Vermont had at least one POW camp. And there were artists, and there's an opera singer I found over in West Michigan. In my state, there's a military base in southern Indiana called Camp Atterbury, where they had Italians, and they built a chapel which is still there, and it's beautiful woodwork, But much of the traces of this program for 3 years doesn't exist anymore. This is the information. I hope you all got that map that I passed out. They have a nice display on the POWs at. Okay, where's my helper? They need some maps here. Did you get here tardy? Were you late? Okay, all right. Okay, where's my helper? I got some right up here. Yeah, there we go. Don't use it as a road map, I won't say. But you can see the 32 camps that have been established. Some of them were very brief and temporary. Some of them were much more permanent. And you've got this information. You've got all 32 camps there. This is an ad from the Shiawassee County Argus Press. Here's a lady down here who needs one too. And if you're a farmer and you can establish the need, and you have to pay the treasury, you pay the government, and they pay they pay for the upkeep of the camp, and they pay compensate the prisoners. And you know what's interesting? The program actually made money. It actually made several $1 million. It was self-sustaining. Everybody got one? This is a picture I took 3 years ago, 2016. Thank you, Carl. This is the Naval Armory over in Benton Harbor, which is in a little bit rough shape, but still exists, and that's where they took the Benton Harbor Germans when they arrived. This is a much more common, there's another hand over here. This is a much more common camp. This is over by Waterloo, if you know where that is, over west of Ann Arbor. Tent camps. They went up quickly. They were there for the harvest, and then they were gone. I'm terrible to drive around with because I want to pull over and look at every plaque. Are you like that? I bet you are. This is the UP. There were German. I'm glad this plaque exists, and it shows that the Germans worked in the Ottawa National Forest, and it was a reconverted Civilian Conservation Corps camp with the barracks, and they added security. By the way, I told you I made this trip to the UP, and why did I go up there? I went to this town called Sidnaw, Michigan. Anybody know where Sidnaw, Michigan is? Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. You get an A for today. Why did I go to Sidnaw, Michigan? Because I was told there was still in existence the guard tower from the German POW camp. And so I drove. It's a long drive. You go up to Marquette, turn left, and drive through a sea of trees for 3 hours, and you're in Sidnaw. Did I find the guard tower? You have to wait a minute. I'll let you have a little suspense there. There's a museum, the Michigan Military and Technological Museum in East Point. They have a display on POWs. I got to take some pictures. They have artifacts. I chuckle when I see this sign, "No person will fraternize with prisoners in any way." I can just say good luck enforcing that one. These are Germans at the end of a work week at Camp Owasso at the racetrack west of town getting their pay coupons. And they're mostly picking sugar beets. This is from the National Archives. Whoops, sorry about that. How about if I just say harvesting sugar beets here? I don't even like sugar beets. I shouldn't say that. But this is an actual camp coupon from Fort Custer, and you can see you can do a lot of damage with $3. You can buy a lot of stuff at the canteen, and they spend it as quickly as they got it. Here are the Germans at Fort Custer. Fort Custer shared these images with me. They're drinking their beer. They're posing. But I can assure you there is schnapps available if you have the money, and also the the Italians in their grappa. This is the mess hall at Fort Custer, and you can see their fatigues with PW on it. That doesn't look like the Waldorf Astoria to me. But you know, a lot of these guys, when they first arrived at Custer and saw the barracks and saw tables with plates and utensils and cups, they started crying because they thought, oh my gosh, we're going to live through the war maybe. And I have to say the Italian mess halls were very popular with American personnel for obvious reasons. These are from Fort Custer, Germans gambling, playing cards, killing time. Ping pong table at Fort Custer, lots of recreational options. Some of the camps had newspapers. They put on holiday celebrations. Some they put on little plays and musicals. They were trying to kill time, you know. Now, this is from Fort Custer. These guys were trained to salute their officers. This is a posed picture at Fort Custer, and this guy's proudly showing his salute. Not all these Germans immediately became Americans or loved America, and some of them secretly celebrated Hitler's birthday on April 20th. Some of them believed right to the end of the war that they were somehow Germany was going to win the war. This guy is showing you the salute. Many people say this is just the way they were trained, and this guy's posing to show that. But this shows you they are not just immediately embracing American ways. This is a camp over by Sparta. Who knows where Sparta, Michigan is in northern Kent County? Fruit country, and a typical tent camp at the edge of town there. And I write about it. I passed out a little thing I wrote in March for the Free Press about the Peach Ridge POWs. These are Germans over in northern Kent County. Here's a picture of them either being dropped off or getting ready to go to work. And one of the big growers in that part of Kent County is the Kraft family. And Merlin Kraft, I talk about it in that little handout I gave you. Merlin Kraft was the son of this family. He was 20. He got a draft deferment, agricultural deferment. He worked side by side with the Germans in the trees, and he got to know them. And Merlin Kraft especially got to know this guy, Roland Detschel, a German captured from Africa. And Roland was kind of the leader of these Germans there because he could speak the most English. And Merlin Kraft told the story that, you know, I was out there with Roland. We're working. They worked very hard. We talked politics. We talked about our families. And Merlin said, one day, Roland said to me, now when Germany wins the war, I'll come back and I'll ask for your farm and then you can work for me. And Merlin said, I never knew if Roland was kidding or not. These are from the museum in East Point. This is the patch for the Italian service unit that they wore in that camp. And here they are at Fort Wayne. The Italians, they look pretty spit and polished there, I must say. And these are some nice pictures from the Ruther archive. These are all pictures now from Fort Wayne. Italians, there were haberdashers and tailors and cobblers and very talented people of all kinds. These guys are sewing on their Italy patch for Italian service unit. The Italian mess hall, very popular. These are butchers at Fort Wayne. They seem to know what they're doing with some meat there. They're posing. Italians, killing time. There was billiards. They had bocce ball courts. You know, they had all of that. And now the next picture from Fort Wayne, I must apologize to my Italians in the room. It's the barber shop at Fort Wayne, and it has every stereotype about happy-go-lucky Italians you can imagine. There we go. They all crammed into, hey, let's get some instruments, and they're posing. But they were very happy for the most part. They were happiest people on the planet, maybe. There were artists. This is from the museum in East Point that I have a relationship with. One of the Germans had a snapshot of his girlfriend, Rena, and they found, I don't know how somebody saved this pencil sketch that one of the prisoners did of his buddy's girlfriend back in Germany. Pretty good. And here's the plaque that goes under it. A couple of guys had drawn sketches. They have 2 sketches over there. This is the soccer field at Camp Owasso. And those guys, they lived, eat, sleep, breathe football. I mean, they talked about girls, they talked about their family, and they talked about soccer. Very high degree of soccer, very high skill. On Sunday games, sometimes camps would play each other, and the whole community would come out and watch them play soccer. That's at Camp Owasso. I got to know a lady named Emily Foster. I spent a whole afternoon with her. She talked about the Germans who came to pick fruit on her family's farm and shared this picture of these mostly young guys. They're playing with her younger sister there, and she said, those guys, they were like big brothers to me. I was 12 years old. They were kind. One guy was an equestrian. He taught me how to ride horses. They liked pets. They liked playing with young kids because some of them had children that they had never seen or met. And she said, my mother, Emily Foster told me, her mother felt bad for these guys and started making food for them. And soon enough, they're almost like family members. This is the author of me with Emily Foster, who's about 88 years old and is ready to fight World War II again. She's a clear as a tack, very sharp-minded, and she remembers those Germans for 3 summers on her farm in southwest Michigan very clearly. Here is the escape, the story from the Shiawassee County paper. Owasso, you can see they were caught quickly, and boy, did this create a sensation when it happened. Shirley and Kitty were tried, and it got international coverage, the trial in Bay City Federal Court, and they were both found guilty of conspiracy. And here's a picture of them. They both got terms in federal prison. I think they thought Kitty was the brains of the operation, so she got 1 year and 3 months. But I guess they did something very foolish. They forgot there was a big war going on out there, and people felt they had to be punished. And here they are being sentenced. And as I say, their lives were pretty much ruined. There were good stories also, like in Owasso here. Here's something from the Argus Press. A group of prisoners Germans working at the cannery, saw a house catch on fire a few blocks from the cannery. They just jumped, scaled the fence, ran toward the house, ran inside, saved this woman and her newborn baby, went back in several times, helped the firefighters. And the Germans at Camp Owasso were mostly remembered very positively. And one of the prisoners said, "I'm glad the guards didn't shoot at us. They must have known we were trying to help." This is from Emily Foster shared this one to me. There were artists, and they had little newspapers. This is a cartoon. I don't believe this still survives. Her father was bringing the Germans back to camp at the end of the day on the flatbed truck, you can see, and they heard this thump on the front bumper. So everybody got out, Mr. Teichman, her father, and the prisoners, and they're all standing around looking down in the middle of the road, and there's a dead chicken. And so that night back at the camp, probably for a little newspaper to make a joke and to cheer people up, there was a cartoonist who did a little amusing picture of that scene. And I do not speak German. I don't know how this thing survives, but it's amazing. I don't speak German, but I'm told the bottom caption says something like, "Another way of hunting." The Germans thought that was quite funny. Here's the terrible accident at Blissfield, the newspaper, and a tragedy that got international news coverage. Here is the funeral services, the chapel at Fort Custer. You can see the flag there, very solemn. This is the burial at Fort Custer National Cemetery. You must go there someday. I want to go to the Volkstrauertag this November. And here's a plaque showing you that the prisoners were there and how in the 50s, they started this, Americans and Germans having a ceremony to memorialize these guys. Here's a program from 1982, and I think that's kind of a beautiful thing. This is a picture I took in 2016. These are the 26 German headstones. And if you didn't know why how did these guys get here? You got to know the story about it. So next time you're on 94 near Augusta, Battle Creek, get off and go to that beautiful cemetery. And if you go to section B, you'll find this. Here's a headstone for Rolf Arnold, soldier, German. And you see the date of death, October 31, 1945. He's one of the Blissfield 16. Here's a picture, a snapshot of Rolf Arnold. How old does that guy look to you? 18. Maybe 18, 19. Doesn't look like he shaves. These are young men. Did I find... ladies and gentlemen, this is the train station in downtown Sidnaw, Michigan that I went to. There was a traffic jam that day. It's pretty remote, and it's lumber company. Did I find the guard tower? Imagine a drum roll. Yes, I did. It was worth the drive. It was my holy grail. Maybe I'll go back to the UP some other time, but I found it. It was in rough shape. It was in 2 pieces. There you go. This is summer of 2016. I am told, not because I was pushing for it, but because people are interested in their local history, the Alger County Historical Society is paying to have that rehabilitated. That's the guard tower at the German camp. And finally, this is my last picture. We returned to Germfask. Raise your hand again if you've heard of Germfask. Yeah, other than tonight. I mean, first you say to yourself, why would you name a town Germfask? It's in the UP. I found out it's because that's the first 8 letters of the 8 founders of the town. I personally would have maybe chosen another name, but Germfask, Michigan. I'm coming back from Sidnaw. I'm ready to become a troll again. I'm going to go across that bridge and come back down to the lower peninsula. But I had to stop in Germfask because I knew there had been a German POW camp there. Camp Autrain, pardon my French. There were Germans right close by. And I wanted to find out if anybody knew about them. So I pulled in. It's about 11:45 on a Monday morning. And I took a picture of the fire department. I went into the store and I said, any of you guys remember the German prisoner of camp around here? And I said, well, not really, but you need to go talk to Omar, 2 doors down at the town hall. He's the city manager and he's the town historian. He's 85 years old. Go find Omar. But you better hurry because he knocks off at 11:15. So you hurry up and get over. I went over there. I spent 6 hours with Omar. And he had a lot of stories. And he said, oh, I remember those Germans very well. We all remembered them. We liked them. They didn't cause trouble. They worked hard. They kept their noses clean. We had a pretty positive feeling about them. And that's how we felt about them. We still feel that way. Now, the other reason I went to Germfask is because I also knew there was a CO camp at Germfask, Michigan. You know what I mean when I say CO? Conscientious objectors. There weren't many in World War II, a few thousand, mostly Quakers and Mennonites and people who convinced their draft board that due to religious or conscience reasons they wouldn't fight, so they gave them alternative service and they sent them to camps around the country to do alternative service. And actually, Camp Germfask in the UP, this is where you were sent if you were a conscientious objector and you misbehaved at another camp. They sent you to the UP, Camp Germfask. The Germans did not understand this concept of what is alternative service if you don't want to fight. Don't they just shoot them? They just couldn't figure that one out. Well, here's the bottom line on all that. I said, Omar, do you remember the conscientious objectors? Oh my God, he still hates those guys. Hates them. Bunch of draft dodgers, troublemakers, communists, malingerers. He said, at least the Germans were fighting for their country. We had respect for them. These guys we didn't like, and they were just nothing but trouble. And he said, I remember the day I was in grammar school, Omar told me, and he said, I got called out of class, and they told me my brother had been killed in the Pacific. So I'm looking over at these guys. I don't like them. So the final thing to this is I've discovered there was a soccer game at Germfask in December in the UP between the O-Train Germans and the Germfask conscientious objectors. Can you imagine the showdown? The entire county came out to watch this. And the CO guys made little shirts that said the CO Bombers. They called themselves the Bombers, I guess an ironic thing. And here's what blew my mind. Omar said, we had that soccer match and we were rooting for the Germans. And I said to myself, that's really upside down in the middle of World War II in the UP. Here's this soccer game. Apparently it was a 1-1 tie. People want to know the score. I guess the Americans were better than they thought they would be. Most of the Germans, they did have English language classes. And if you were a good citizen, you could even take college extension courses or maybe a course in drafting. They tried to give some sort of education thing there. Most of them, I gather, didn't really learn much English, just broken English. The person who spoke the most English was usually the leaders in the camp, and they would be the liaison. But it's interesting, they also tried to teach, they had democracy classes. There was a thought, well, before we send them back to Europe, we'll teach them democracy. And these guys, they signed up for it. They slept in class. They thought it might get them home sooner in the line, you know. And it's like, how does a bill become a law, you know? But I would say the best advertisement for democracy And this was their gratitude and their sense of who the Americans were that they interacted with, who mostly treated them, with respect and humanity. I'm going to end with one final anecdote from the Sparta camp. And as we're on the eve of Memorial Day, we should be thinking about our veterans, and we should also, the D-Day's 75th is coming up. There's a story, and I wrote it up for the Free Press. In Sparta, the German camp was on the edge of town, and there was a family with the house right across the street, the Lamoureux family. I don't know if you had a chance to read it. And Alice Lamoureux, the mother there, they had the 3 flags in their front window in the porch with blue stars. And she could see the Germans in the German camp right across the street. She could see the guys getting loaded up and then coming back from work and, going into the camp as they're working in the trees, and Roland Detschel and all those guys. Well, as you know, those blue stars, one by one, turned gold. Al, Donald, Howard, her 3 sons were all killed abroad in battles, 1 in the Pacific, I think, and 2 across the Atlantic. And the people in town worried, how is she going to deal with this? She's lost, it's like the Fighting Sullivans, or Saving Private Ryan. It must be very hard for her to look at these guys. Well, her daughter later reported, my mother was strong, and she never really held any resentment against these young guys that she saw every day. And in fact, she sent over cookies and some things to them, and she just saw them. She didn't carry any resentment. Well, one day, as the 3rd star turned gold, the German groups, they were being dropped off at the end of the day. And without any pre-announcement about it, most of them went in the camp, but a small detail marched in very solemn ranks across the street, stood below the porch of the Lamoureux house, and gave a very long, solemn, silent salute. And then they did an about face, and they marched, and they went into camp. And Merlin Kraft asked Roland Detschel, why did you guys do that? And he said, well, we have mothers too, and we understand, how do you say, sacrifice. Now, I tell that story because it is a nice example of respect, a sense of common humanity that happened in Sparta, Michigan. And there's a lot of stories like that. There are comical stories and heartbreaking stories. It's a little-known story. It's a chapter of our history that I think we should know about, and hopefully young people will be interested in it. I did bring some. I sell them out of the back of my car. I'm not embarrassed to do that. I have Detroit in World War II, and I have Michigan POW camps. I'll sign a copy for you. They're $20 a piece. I'll personalize it, whatever. But let me just say again, did I tell you you're a beautiful audience? And I thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause for doing history on a Wednesday night. Thank you. Thank you, Carl.